back everyone to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video we're going to continue our examination of Plato's Credo, in which, as we saw last time, Credo is attempting to convince Socrates to escape prison and avoid the sentence of death that was given to him at trial. Now, the main point that we saw from Socrates last time is essentially his rejection of Credo's idea that the majority would look down upon him staying in prison. And what Socrates argues is that we have no reason to care about the majority. First of all, the majority cannot truly harm us. They may be able to kill us or exile us or take away our property, but they cannot truly harm our soul. They cannot make us ignorant. Second, there's no reason to really care about the opinions of the majority either, that Socrates or Credo might have a bad reputation. The only opinions we should care about are expert opinions, and specifically in this case, expert opinions about what is good for the soul, which means experts in justice and injustice or morality. So if Credo wants to convince Socrates that the right thing to do is to escape prison, he needs to make a case that it's the moral thing to do, the just thing to do. And it's not that Socrates doesn't care about any of the other considerations that Credo brings up. So in this passage, what we see is that Socrates addresses many of the other concerns that Credo is given to convince him to leave prison, right? So he talks about, you might have a concern for money or a concern for reputation or your children or even your life, right? These are all sort of concerns people have. But what Socrates wants to say is that all these things are simply secondary. The primary concern is justice. And of course, we can think of many cases in which people, sort of get these twisted around. It's quite common for the sake of money or reputation to do something unjust, to lie, to steal, to fraud people. Nothing could be more common than doing something unjust for the sake of one's children. You can imagine the ways in which you might disadvantage other people unfairly so your own child can get ahead. And when we think about one of Socrates' famous claims that the most important thing isn't living, but living well, what he's saying is that your own life, your own continued existence, is of secondary importance in comparison to being just. So what we need to consider then is, would it be unjust of Socrates to escape prison or not? And no matter which way we answer, why? Okay, so to understand where Socrates is coming from, we first need to outline one fundamental principle, which I'm going to call the justice absolutism principle, because it underlies the major argument he's going to make here. So Socrates says, do we say that one should never do justice intentionally? Or may injustice be done in some circumstances but not in others? Now, given what we just said, that Socrates says justice is of primary importance, because justice is connected to the good of your soul, we can guess what he would say here. And in fact, of course, Socrates does say that one should never do injustice intentionally. So call that the justice absolutism principle. And again, remember, as we saw last time, the reason he's so committed to justice and never intentionally performing injustice is because it is connected to the good of our soul, which, as he explains in this passage, is the most valuable portion of us. If life wouldn't be worth living with a horribly ravaged body, how could life be worth living with a horribly ravaged soul? And so for this reason, Socrates is absolutely committed to justice and never intentionally doing something that's unjust. Now, how does he use this claim? Well, he outlines the following argument, which I'll call the argument from justice absolutism, to say why he should not escape from prison. Why, in fact, Credo is wrong in urging him to do so. So the first premise is just the justice absolutism principle that we already just outlined. One should never intentionally perform an act of injustice. Okay, now we should stop and think about that for a moment, because this sounds right. You might say, well, of course, injustice is bad, and we should never intentionally do what's bad, so yeah, I guess we should never intentionally do unjust things. But is that really the case? Are there any situations in which injustice is actually called for? Well, the first one that might come to mind, which will be actually quite relevant here, is what if someone has done or acted unjustly toward you? Right, so if someone has lied and cheated and defrauded you, does that mean you're allowed to lie, cheat, and defraud them? If someone steals from you, are you allowed to steal from them? Now, this is probably a sort of conversation you had, you may have had with your parents when you were very young. And the idea that your parents may have expressed, which many do, and Socrates is expressing here, is that two wrongs don't make a right. So your brother or sister did something bad to you. No, you don't get to retaliate against them. Two wrongs don't make a right. But it's interesting that we don't always seem to follow that principle. And there seems to be a difference between the way we look at it with individual people and with governmental structures. So for instance, if you commit a crime, if you steal from someone, if you murder someone, the state will punish you and do something normally that would be wrong or harmful to you in return. So you steal someone, you murder someone, you'll have to go to jail. Normally, it would be wrong to put someone in jail. It would be unjust to put someone in jail. But we say the state is allowed to do it. So what do we say? Does that mean the state is intentionally performing an act of injustice? Are they violating Socrates' principle? Suppose another country attacks our country. Right? Suppose they unjustly attack us. They were not provoked. They didn't need to in a defensive way. They simply wanted to take us over or gain power and influence or whatever the case may be. Well, any government would retaliate in that case. It would defend itself. Is that returning injustice for injustice? And this is particularly important in this context because depending on what you think about the two wrongs don't make a right principle, which Socrates is saying here, that's going to affect what you think about Socrates' situation itself. Because again, Socrates admits that he has been unjustly put into prison. So we might wonder, why is he so committed to this idea of justice absolutism? And because he is so committed to this idea, we can see how the first part of the argument follows pretty straightforwardly. So P1, one should never intentionally perform justice. P2, well, if one should never intentionally perform injustice, then one should never do injustice in return. As I was just explaining, if you're really committed to the idea that it's never okay to do something unjust, then the fact that someone has done something unjust to you doesn't make it okay for you to retaliate and do injustice in return. So Socrates says, so one shouldn't do injustice in return for injustice, as the majority of people think. So he says, look, the majority of people would say, of course you have to retaliate. If someone does something unjust to you, do something unjust back to them. But he says the majority's wrong here. If we're really committed to injustice, if that forms a fundamental harm to our soul, then we should never do it. Okay? And if P1 and P2 are true, then the first conclusion follows, one should never do injustice in return. We should never return injustice for injustice. All right. And so we see him express this rather vociferously, rather straightforwardly. So one must neither do injustice in return nor wrong any man, no matter what he has suffered at his hands. And to just understand how sort of extreme a claim this is, no matter how bad it is that someone else has bad a thing someone else has done to you, you cannot do anything unjust to them. Now, I was bringing up before this idea that we treat governments and individuals differently here. Think about the way we would commonly respond. So if someone stole from you, we would say that, okay, you shouldn't just go steal from them. What's the proper channel? Well, you go through the legal system. And the legal system exacts a punishment on that person. Now, you can disagree with that. You can say, well, maybe our legal system and our government is illegitimate. In fact, we'll be getting into those issues. But the point is to be consistent with Socrates' principles. You need some way to say any retaliation must be a just retaliation. And it can't just be you striking out yourself against that person just because they've done something wrong to you. And so the first conclusion of the argument simply says we can never do injustice and retaliation. We can never return injustice for injustice. Alright, so the third premise. If Socrates were to escape prison, then he would be doing injustice in return by breaking a just agreement. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. Socrates is saying we're never allowed to do injustice in return. Now, if he were to escape, he says that's what he would be doing. So this shows a couple things. First, it shows that he does, in fact, think that the state has acted unjustly toward him. And also gives us an indication of what the injustice is. Because look, you might say, okay, the state has unjustly punished him, unjustly put him in prison. He escapes. Well, who's he really harming? You know, like, what harm is he actually doing? It's not like he's going to go out and steal from people or murder. That wasn't the charges that were brought against him. How is anybody harmed by him not remaining in prison? What difference does it make? Well, Socrates says the difference it makes is because he has made some sort of just agreement, and that just agreement implies he must remain in prison. Now, this should bring up a few questions to your mind. First of all, what is this agreement? And with whom did he ever make this agreement? Who's on the other end of this agreement? Who did he make an agreement with to stay in prison in these circumstances? Well, as we see in the below passage, Socrates suggests that he has a sort of agreement with the city of Athens itself. So he says, should one do the things one has agreed with someone to do, provided they are just, or should one cheat? One should do them. So first, if you make a just agreement, then you should follow through. And notice, this doesn't mean that just any agreement you have to follow through. Right? So if someone forces you at gunpoint to agree to embezzle a lot of money from the company you work at, you might have agreed, but that's not a just agreement. They forced you into this situation. You wouldn't be morally obligated to follow through. Or on the other hand, you might imagine you could make a consensual agreement for something that's immoral. If you hire like a hitman to go out and murder somebody, well, both parties may have agreed to that arrangement, but the thing agreed to is fundamentally immoral, so it would actually be wrong of that hitman to follow through on the agreement. So Socrates isn't saying you have to follow through on every agreement, just the just ones. And so then he gives further indication, well, who did he make this just agreement with? If we leave this place without having persuaded the city, are we treating some people badly, and those whom we should least of all treat in that way or not? Are we standing by agreements that are just or not? So he sees it's an agreement with the city. Now, this is a very important point, because at this point what Socrates is saying is that the reason he can't escape prison is because he's made some sort of agreement with the government to abide by its laws. And the law dictates at this moment, because he was convicted at trial, that he must remain in prison and must accept his punishment of death. And one of the reasons this dialogue is so famous, because now we come upon a foundational issue in political philosophy. It's just the issue of, why should you follow the law? Where does the authority of the government come from? So think about all the various laws you have to follow. You have to drive on a certain side of the street. You can't park in certain places. You can't go over a speed limit. You can't defraud people. You can't steal. You can't murder other people. There's all sorts of laws that impinge on your freedom. Without those laws, you might say, well, I'm free to do whatever I want. I'm more free. And then you might say, well, where does the government get the authority to tell me I can't do these things? Socrates says the authority comes from some sort of agreement, but then you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute, and this is the fundamental point, I don't remember making that agreement. Where did that agreement come from? And that's precisely the issue we're going to be looking at in the remainder of this dialogue. It touches on Socrates' particular situation. It also touches on the situation of all of us, because we all live under the authority of a government. And we all might reflect to ourselves and ask, why do we have to listen to this government? Okay. So it's interesting the way that Socrates frames the discussion. So at this point, Socrates largely takes control of the discussion, and he launches into a pretty long speech where Crito really doesn't interject very often. And when he launches into the speech, he takes on a persona of the laws and of the city. So he imagines this. He says, and suppose the laws and the city community came and confronted us and said, tell us, Socrates, what do you intend to do? So here we see Socrates not having to justify himself to Crito, not having to justify himself to any other particular person, but Socrates is imagining that he's going to follow Crito's advice, he's going to escape from prison, and now he has to justify himself to the laws themselves. And so, of course, Socrates is going to need an argument for why he should escape prison, and the laws, we might say, would have some arguments saying, well, here's why you have to obey us. Okay, and so he's just using this generalized idea of imagining yourself in a conversation with the governmental authority that limits your freedom. Why do I have to, obey you? Why do I have to do what you say? Here are the reasons. All right, so in Socrates' speech, the laws are going to make a couple of our two main arguments. We'll look at one of them in this lesson and a second one in the next video. So what we need here then is really a description of what this agreement is, right? So then the laws are replied, well, was that also part of the agreement between you and us, Socrates, or did you agree to stand by whatever judgments the city rendered? So the laws say, look, whatever this agreement is, it implied that you had to always follow our judgments, no matter what they were. Okay, so if that's the case, it's a pretty extreme thing. We need a better understanding of what is this agreement and where does this force come from. And there are really two issues here. When the laws say, was that also part of the agreement between you and us, Socrates? It's hinting that there is some agreement with the laws. That you, as a citizen of a country, have in some sense made an agreement with your government to follow its authority. So that's one issue. Where did that agreement come from? A second issue is, what is the authority of those laws? How extreme is it? The second part of the passage says, did you agree to stand by whatever judgments the city rendered? So suppose you made, just do it in an interpersonal context. Suppose you make an agreement with someone. You say, okay, I'm going to agree to follow whatever rules you set for me. Okay, so let's say you both consensually entered into this agreement, and the person says, okay, well, now you have to go make me a snack. So you make him a snack, and they have to go run my errands. Okay, that's fine. I'm not sure why you'd enter this agreement, but you could. But you might think, even if you both consensually entered into this agreement, and you agreed to just essentially do whatever they commanded you, there would be some limits. Again, if that person commanded you, go murder someone, you might say, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, it was understood that I didn't agree to murder someone. And so there's one question about where the agreement comes from, and there's a second question about what is the extent of that agreement? How much can that agreement make us do? How strong a hold does it have on us? So there's the agreement with the laws and the authority that the judgment of the laws has. How strong is it? And the two arguments that the laws make in Socrates' speech can be seen as addressing each of these issues. And the first argument I'm going to call the argument from paternal authority, and it really addresses this idea of the authority of the laws, how strong that authority is. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's just start with the first premise, this argument from paternal authority. When some individual or entity, A, exists in a relation of paternal authority over some other individual or entity, B, then B must either persuade A that its commands are unjust or obey A's commands. Okay, so I just want to look at that highlighted part of the premise first. The idea that when this relationship of paternal authority exists, and we'll talk about what that relationship is, but when it exists, you either have to obey, persuade that authority it's wrong, or do whatever it says, or obey it. And we're going to call this the persuade or obey doctrine. And we can see this in the speech, right? The laws say, yet we offer him a choice and do not harshly command him to do what he's told. On the contrary, we offer two alternatives. He must either persuade us or do what we say. Now, it's worth thinking about how this is relevant in Socrates' own case. Because in Socrates' own situation, you might say, well, he had the chance to persuade the state. At trial, he had a chance to make his defense. He made his defense to the best of his ability, but he unsuccessfully persuaded them. And because he unsuccessfully persuaded the state, he now must do whatever the state commands. And if the state commands that he must be put to death, then so be it. That's what the persuade or obey doctrine says. And notice how this sort of tilts the balance of power. The persuade or obey doctrine says the state holds ultimate authority over your life. The way you can change that is by persuading the state to change its mind. But under no circumstances are you ever allowed to outright rebel against the state. And this shows how just radical of a doctrine this is. Because many philosophers, and we'll look at some in our next video, have held no, there is actually a right in some cases to resist the government. It may be a narrow right, it may only be in extreme circumstances, but sometimes it may be the case that you may need to disobey and resist the commands of the government. But according to the persuade or obey doctrine, those are not options you have. Either you make the state change his mind, or you follow what they say. Alright, so that's the one part of the premise. But the other, remember this argument from paternal authority, it said, well, when does the persuade or obey doctrine apply? Whenever there's a relation of paternal authority. And what do we mean by this sort of relation? Well, it has really the following characteristics. If we say A has paternal authority over B, we would say A is in some sense superior to B. A is responsible for the well-being of B. A can sometimes override B's autonomy or freedom. And A deserves an attitude of respect or loyalty from B. So you might ask, well, what's an example of this relationship? The easiest one is parents and children. And in fact, of course, that's where the root word of paternal authority comes from, this idea of a parental relationship. And if you think about the relationship between parents and children, they exhibit all these characteristics, right? So a parent is superior to a child in wisdom and knowledge and being able to understand, right? A child can't do those things and needs to rely on the parent. The parent's responsible for the child, right? So it's the parent's responsibility to make sure that the child is well off in life. And sometimes that means the parent's going to need to override a child's freedom. So in the case of my son, who's only a month and a half years old, 1.5 years old, in the case of my son, when he refuses to eat his vegetables, I have to do what I can to get him to eat his vegetables, even when he doesn't want to. Parents, of course, will take away all manner of privileges if it's necessary to keep the child safe, right? Or they will not allow a child to drive a car if they've shown themselves to be inadequate at doing so. There's all sorts of ways in which parents override a child's autonomy for their own good. And because of all the effort, work, and patience that we hope parents have, we say that children should show respect and loyalty to their parents. Okay, so it's pretty uncontroversial that something like this exists between parents and children. But should we see the state in this way? Now, it's interesting, in our political context in the modern world, which is much different from ancient Athens, in the modern world, we largely actually don't see the state quite this way. We don't see the state as a parent of us. But notice that we still talk about patriotism. And the word patriotism derives from the Latin word pater, which means father. So when you talk about a sort of patriotic attitude toward the state, there is an analog to the sort of respect or loyalty that we think a child should have towards a parent. Okay, so P1 just says that whenever this relationship exists, then it's the case that the child or the citizen either must persuade the authority or must obey. P2 says the state exists in a relation of paternal authority over Socrates. So P2 says that the relationship between Socrates and the law, Socrates and the government, is like the relationship between a child and a parent. And to make this point, Socrates identifies the various ways in which the state is sort of like a parent to him. So the laws say, in the first place, wasn't it we who gave you birth? Wasn't it through us that your father married your mother? Well, yeah, that's true. Well, then what about the laws dealing with bringing up and educating of children, under which you were educated yourself? Didn't those of us laws who regulate that area prescribe correctly when we ordered your father to educate you in the arts and physical training? So the laws say, look, we allowed for the marriage of your parents, which brought you into existence. We allowed for your education, which allowed you to thrive and flourish as a human being. So, and of course, these are responsibilities that parents have as well. Parents are certainly responsible, and to some extent, for making sure that their children are well educated, or as well educated as possible. So would seem to be some analogs here between the state and parents. And the laws go on as well. Good, then since you were born, brought up, and educated, can you deny first that you're our offspring? And he even says, enslave both yourself and your ancestors. Now, what should we think of the word slave here? He's not technically saying that Socrates is a slave in the sense of being owned, but he's saying slave in the sense of being a subject, in the sense that Socrates is subject to the will of the laws and the will of the state. And if that's so, do you think what's just is based on an equality between you and us? That whatever we try to do to you is just for you to do it to us in return? So notice the laws have made the case that, well, we allowed for your existence in the marriage of your parents, we educated you, we provided you a stable society in which you could thrive, we made sure there were roadways, that there were buildings, that there was a legal system that punished wrongdoers, that kept you safe. We did all these things. So how could you say you're in a relationship of equality with us? How could you say that, if we do something unjust to you, that you can retaliate? That would seem to suggest that you are our equal. But no, you're not. And remember one of the things we said about the idea of paternal authority. When there's a relationship of paternal authority, we see the two parties as being in some sense unequal. The parent is in some sense superior to the child. And so the laws are making the same case here. And the laws even suggest that Socrates should have this attitude of respect and loyalty toward them. They say, or are you so wise that it has escaped your notice that your fatherland is more worthy of honor than your mother and father and all your other ancestors? That is to be revered and more sacred, and is held in greater esteem. So the laws make the case that if you think about it, the stable society in which you can flourish and be educated and have a community, that could be more important to your well-being than even your own mother and father, who similarly relied on that same system. And if it's important to honor your mother and father, then ought you to also honor the state? Shouldn't you see the state as a sort of parent that has been responsible for your well-being, that has done so much for you, and for that reason is superior to you? And so, for that reason, the laws say, therefore you must either persuade us or do whatever we command. Okay. Now there's a lot to say about this argument. It's a very different conception of the relationship between the citizen and the state than I think a lot of modern people have. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about what you think about this argument. I'll give you a few sort of questions to guide you as you think about it. So, first of all, we might think about this idea that whenever there's a relationship of paternal authority, there's a persuade or obey doctrine. Take the case of parents and children. Is what P1 is saying is true? If a child cannot convince a parent to change his or her mind, does it always follow that the child must obey that command? Does it matter what the parent is in fact commanding? We also might think about the sense of inequality that is supposed to exist in these relationships. So there is a sense in which parents and children are unequal. But of course it's not forever. Eventually the child grows up. Eventually the child becomes an adult and is still the child of the parent, but then there's a sense of equality. Does that cause a problem when we start thinking about the parent-child relationship as similar to the relationship between the state and the citizen. And so also let's think about P2. Do you think that the state exists in a relation of paternal authority over you? Do you see the state as being responsible for your well-being? Do you see the state as being worthy of your respect and honor? Do you see the state as being superior to you as an individual? And one way to start thinking about this is that, although again it's common to not think this is the case, many of the laws we have are in fact of this sort. And you can think of many examples, but just to give one, laws we have against using many sorts of drugs. Now you could give a non-paternalistic justification. You could say, well, the reason we have to make heroin, for instance, illegal is because of the harm of the drug trade and etc. But there's also another reason commonly given. It's just very bad for people, it's highly addicting, and the state is going to protect you from that harm. Right? This is not the only law like that. And so the first thing to ask yourself is that legitimate? Do you think it's legitimate for the government to pass a law restricting your freedom and doing it for your own good? Just as a parent would restrict the freedom of a child to always eat junk food or drive too fast or rot their mind watching YouTube videos all day. Can the state, is it okay for the state to restrict the freedom of its citizens for their own good, just like parents to restrict the freedom of their children for their own good? In any case, I think these are the questions we need to consider further. I hope this video was helpful and useful and at least somewhat entertaining, and I will see you in the next video.